Thank you. So it's Earth Day, which is kind of Halloween for environmentalists. I know some of you, because I talked to you before, have to be here for like an assignment or a paper or something. So if you've never heard any of this stuff before, it might be a little bit intense. But let me start with just some quick survey questions. So how many of you can raise your hands more than once? How many of you are moderately to extremely concerned about environmental issues, including climate change and ocean acidification? Okay. How many people are worried moderately to extremely about the U.S. economy in the next 10 or 20 years? Most people. How many are worried about our psychological habituations, addictions, behaviors? A lot of people, slightly less. So it's 15 years ago that I left Wall Street, and in that intervening time I've come across a lot of different tribes of people. I've been very fortunate. And I've learned a few things, which I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, but I know personally 8 or 9 people who think that humans are going to go extinct in the next century because of climate change. I know 10 people personally that think climate change is an absolute hoax generated for more taxes. So I'm getting at disparate beliefs here. I know a lot of people personally that pray to God every day and expect to be answered. I know a lot of people personally that believe in the cosmos and that we originated from cyanobacteria, et cetera, in the ocean. I know people personally that think we will have 10 to 15 billion humans alive by the end of this century. And I know people that think because of resource scarcity and other issues that there's going to be major wars and we're going to have a population crash. I know people that are so anti-factory farming because it's got a little Auschwitz feel to it that they don't eat any meat. And I still have a lot of people that eat meat on every meal of the day, and the pizza lover pizzas and all that stuff. And I have friends that think the solar revolution will take over the world and everyone will be happily motoring on and using electricity using solar and renewables. And I also have a tribe of friends that think renewables are just fossil fuel extenders and they're polluting and aren't the story. The point of me pointing all this out is one of the things I've learned in the last decade or so is that facts are necessary but not sufficient. And people have belief systems, and these belief systems in our modular brains are, you can hold a lot of them at the same time, and they don't have to be congruent with each other. And so my purpose in talking mostly to the young people tonight isn't to give you a lot of facts, it's to give you kind of a story that you can experience and internalize for yourself and maybe change some of your own ideals or self-identity rather than just switch on some new facts. So what I am going to talk about today is the intersection of those 3 crises. And as Jeremy said, I've never given this talk before. I actually worked a lot on it yesterday and today, so if I hit many, 2/3 of my main points, I'll be happy. But we're going to talk about the intersection of our environmental, our economic, and our kind of personal psychological problems. And what I'm going to do is, I don't have the answers. I'm really an analyst, and I realize that telling people the problems and then saying thank you very much, good night, is no longer cuts it. So I'm going to try and offer some suggestions, at least what to think about and what to consider, especially as young people, as we face what's coming. So I'm going to suggest things in the middle of that circle that apply to all of the situations. And it's my belief that if someone says, well, that's a bad idea or that's a good idea, it doesn't really make sense unless you ask, what's the purpose? What do we aspire to? What's the goal? And I will make no bones about it. My goal is, my aspiration is to aspire to a deep time future coexistence with humans and other large complex life and intact ecosystems. And that's like 100 years and beyond, but no one thinks about that. No one talks about it. We only talk about the next 3 months or whatever. So my purpose for the young people is to engage in this game, in this chess game, which is we are living in the Anthropocene with the human-dominated natural world. And so if I go back to this little yellow circle, of course, different people have different objectives. Everyone cares about themselves, obviously. They care about their family and community, their country. Some people care about other species, and some people care about other generations. There's also, the sociopathic type of person, the agenda of the gene, where it's largely dominated by issues of the self. And then there's some rare people who the self and their nation are kind of small, and they really care about other species and other generations. So I'm also going to talk different tiers of your own personal interests. But first I'm going to talk about the problems. And usually I give a whole 1 hour on this, but I'm going to condense it into 15-minute kind of summary. A little of this will be overlap with what you heard last year. And then the rest of my talk is I'm going to have around 30 suggestions, especially for young people, what to consider, what to do about our circumstance. So let me start with environment. I'm going to read a quote from a book I'm reading. 20,000 years ago in North America, huge condor-like birds with 16-foot wingspans were tearing open the carcasses of hippo-sized ground sloths. Mammoths and mastodons were giving themselves dust baths and pushing over trees. Cheetahs and no less than 5 other kinds of big cats were living on an extravagant assortment of camel, llama, horse, deer, muskox, goat, and sheep species, with its giant bears, giant beavers, giant armadillo-like species, giant tortoises, etc. North America was, without exaggeration, a super Serengeti, containing many more big animal species than present-day Africa. I actually just learned that a few weeks ago. We all hear about the dinosaurs 70 million years ago. 20,000 years ago, North America had more large animal species than Africa. So here's another quote, which I'll read out loud. "We live in a zoologically impoverished world from which all the hugest, the fiercest, and the strangest forms have recently disappeared. And it is no doubt a much better world for us now that they have gone. Yet it is a marvelous fact, and one that has not been sufficiently dwelt upon, this sudden dying out of so many large mammalia, not in one place, but in half the land surface of the globe." Who said that? Alfred Russel Wallace, 1876. So, in the last 40 years, we've lost half of the animal life on the planet. What a crazy thing to say. We've lost approximately 40% of the insect biomass. Europe has lost 400 million birds in the last 25 years, which is about 30%. We are undergoing a 6th great extinction, and humans are the cause. This is the last male white rhino alive. This picture was from a few days ago. And he's under a 24-hour guard. There's 3 females left. He doesn't even have a horn. So this graphic is kind of intense, but it's pretty accurate. The graph on the left is the green is wild animal, terrestrial wild animal, not in the ocean. Biomass estimate 12,000 years ago at the dawn of agriculture, and the little tiny red sliver is human biomass. 12,000 years ago, there was about 1 million of us. How much they weighed. The graph on the right is this year estimate. Humans are the red. All of our livestock and domesticated animals are the various shades of blue. Wild animals are the green. We outweigh wild terrestrial animals 62 to 1. Humans and our food supply chain. We are headed for a world where the largest animal is going to be a cow in the next century or before. So, many of you are versed and concerned about climate and ocean acidification risk. I'm not going to really talk about those tonight, other than to say, I don't know whether those risks are 90% or 20%, but they seem pretty large, and a sapient species would, even if there was a 5% chance of kind of biosphere ending risk, we should do something about it. Yet we need to be like 98.7% certain, et cetera. So this is also a risk. Okay, the psychological. We evolved with a brain that had very long periods of slow, nothing much going on, and it was honed for danger and reward. And now we have these Facebook and all these things that's instant, And it's what's called a supernormal stimuli that hijacks our neural structure to think, ooh, there's a mastodon, ooh, there's food, but it's actually just a Facebook like or something like that. This is an ethologist graph showing that mama birds, if you paint a popsicle stick bright red and make it larger than the real baby birds, they will feed it more to the point where the other baby birds will die because they'll starve. That's called a supernormal stimuli. And we are all undergoing supernormal stimuli in our lives every day with all the technology and everything we have. So one might argue that natural gas, oil, and coal were something that we found a couple hundred years ago, and now we're living off of the lottery benefits of these fuels, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. And just like a lottery winner thinks it's going to be all great, eventually 5 years later, everyone wants money from them, they're addicted to such and such, and it's not all good news. Okay, so I'm going to spend about 10 minutes on the economy and energy because I think it's important, especially for environmentally aware people to understand. So in nature, there's such a thing as a trophic pyramid where energy underpins everything, and at every level of exchange, there's an energy loss, and the sunlight grows the plants, the herbivores eat the plants, the predators eat the herbivores, etc. And it's the same thing in the human system. We use primary natural capital, trees, and in this case, fossil fuels, and we turn that real capital into secondary capital, like tractors and computers and toasters, plus services, Starbucks. And then on top of it all, we have financial marker capital, which is tertiary capital that represents the lower levels of the pyramid. So everything on this page costs around $60 or $70, but oil is special. We know it's special, but economists still don't treat it as special. The equation on the top is the classic economic equation that shows where our productivity and growth comes from. And technology and capital and labor are all that really matter. And energy is not in there at all. And yet, 1 barrel of oil has 1,700 kilowatt hours of work. And Jeremy or I, shoveling snow or digging ditches or whatever, do about 0.6 of a kilowatt hour in one day. So 1 barrel of oil, which now costs us $60, although it costs oil companies $70 or $80, does 10 or 11 years work of human labor. That's really, if you think about it, if you remember nothing else from this talk, it's pretty profound. So every American has about 60 barrel of oil equivalents of these energy co-workers standing behind us in the form of coal, oil, and natural gas every day that we don't even consider. So relative to hunter-gatherer, forager humans that lived not so long ago in our past, we use around 50 times more energy. So if you add up all the direct solar labor, solar inputs, and you add up all of the human labor, about 4.5 billion people on the planet that are in the workforce, that ends up being 11% of our labor force. The other 89% are fossil fuels, if you account for the amount of work that's done. So those fossil co-workers, which we pull out of the ground for next to nothing because all the work in processing them was done over millions and hundreds of millions of years, have resulted in higher wages, higher profits, lower priced stuff, and more people. This is not population, but this is GDP per capita for the last 3,000 years. And you can see it was largely flat until we found fossil fuels in the mid-1700s, and is having a moonshot since then. This graph is from a speech that the governor of the Bank of England gave last month. You can read it online. It's 30 pages long of text. He did not mention the word energy once in explaining our wealth and our productivity. So I don't have time to fully get into this tonight, but really the story of industrialization is adding huge amounts of super cheap fossil labor to replace things that humans used to do. For example, with a car, we add hundreds of units of fossil mechanical energy to build the roads, cars and the tire and the gasoline, to replace what humans used to do, walking, and it gets us there 5 times faster or something like that. So every mechanical process in the world is something like that, where we add large amounts of fossil workers to replace what we used to do. Now, in biology, there's something called optimal foraging theory, which some argue is one of the driving forces of evolution, that organisms and ecosystems that have a large energy payoff to their energy investment have more advantages, have better mating opportunities, have more excess caloric energy for their offspring and to fight off predators, etc. And it stands to reason that this is also important in our human sphere. This is something called the energy return on energy investment, or EROI. And you can see that this has been declining over time. For discovering oil back in the 1920s and 30s, we would get almost 1,000 to 1 for every oil we discovered. It would only cost us 1 barrel. And you can see that that's declined over time, where now it's, for every oil barrel we're discovering, we have to spend 2/10 of that barrel in all the seismology and the drilling and all the work and effort to find it. But what about technology? Technology can offset this, right? Well, I would say that there's 4 types of technology, 4 general types. One is we are replacing what humans used to do with vast amounts of mechanical energy. The second is we invent new gadgets and new resource conversions that give us pleasing brain chemicals and whatever that we never had before. And then there's resource energy efficiency. You make a power plant more efficient. It uses the energy better. And then the fourth one would be new inventions, new ways to frack oil out of the ground, new solar panels. But I would argue that by far and away, the first 2 types of energy dominate, types of technology dominate the story. And those 2 types of energy, of technology, really are a proxy for energy use. In other words, this is total primary energy use of humans the last 200 years. It goes up and up and up because when we develop more and more gadgets and use more and more tractors and electricity, no matter what the kind, we need more. I've got a picture of the Borg here, which represents kind of that our human economy is a dissipative structure and we need more energy input to keep everything going. But what about money? Doesn't money make the world go round? Yes, money is what we all agree has value, but it's really just a claim on future energy. And money comes into the system automatically with no natural resource tether. If I get a loan at the bank, they put the money in my account. Nowhere else in the world did money leave. So we're adding more and more money over time, the red line, and our natural capital is slowly declining over time, the white line. At some point they intersect where there's too many monetary claims versus the underlying natural capital. I don't know when that point is. I could argue that it was in the 1970s. Every single year since I've been alive, we've added more debt to our system than our economy has grown. Debt has grown more than GDP every year. So since 2000, GDP of the world has gone up $16 trillion, and global debt has gone up $112 trillion. So we're having economic difficulties, and we're papering it over by adding more guarantees and artificially low interest rates, and there's money sloshing around at the top, but our resource situation is getting worse. I don't have a slide in here, I forgot to put it in, but extraction costs for oil have gone up 17% a year for the last decade. So it's now the marginal barrel of oil costs around $70 for oil companies to break even. The real higher difficulty stuff is $80 or $90. And yet oil prices are like $50. So what's going on there? Well, there's different prices for oil. And the one we should be paying attention to is how much it costs the energy companies. Okay, so what's our situation? We humans turn energy and resources into dollars into feelings and neurotransmitters plus waste. This is the human ecosystem all in our past, and it will be in our future. So we take a look at this trophic pyramid, where tertiary capital into secondary primary into secondary into tertiary capital. But what happened about 10,000 years ago in the agricultural revolution is humans started to band together. They weren't just unique little tribes. They started to form villages and cities with the objective of optimizing what? Surplus, grain surplus. And so for the last 12,000 years, we've acted more and more like a collective hive in order to optimize surplus. But right now, we're not optimizing grain surplus. We're optimizing monetary surplus and tertiary financial markers in the stock market. So what's happened is we've used up some of our real capital on the bottom. We've shrunken our manufacturing base a little bit, really expanded our service base, and then our Wall Street markers have gotten huge because we're adding more and more money to paper over some of these problems. So if you think about fossil fuels being so incredibly cheap, there's a dark side to that, right? Because if you're an owner of capital, if you're a CEO of a company and you're kind of struggling, what you do then is hire more mechanical labor and don't hire those people. So this is a graph showing real wages for an average American the last 130 years. And real wages peaked in the early 1970s. Yet productivity, the darker line, has continued higher. And this is because it's cheaper to hire machines to do things. So this is just kind of a funny or sad graph, depending how you look at it. The blue line is waiters and bartenders, now at 11 million in the United States. The red line is manufacturing workers. The gray is the difference between them. This is an all-time low, the difference between manufacturing and bartenders, which kind of supports the point I just made. So median household income peaked 15 years ago in every county in Wisconsin, except for the county by La Crosse. I forgot the name of that county. But for 95% of Americans, in the last decade, after inflation incomes are the same or lower than they were a decade ago. Only the top 5% are making more than they were a decade ago. So if we think of government forecasts of our economy going forward, there is no government body in the world that forecasts flat or negative growth. They all forecast positive growth, but they're forecasting gross growth, right? They don't account for, if we spend more and more energy on the energy sector, that means that people are poorer or we need more in that sector. I'm going to skip over this because it's kind of an obtuse point, but it's important. So why aren't we doing anything about this? Well, think of a crowd of penguins. The ones on the outside, they huddle to stay warm. The ones on the outside are cold. It's freaking cold here. The ones on the inside are toasty warm. That's like our politicians. There's no problem. I'm one of the guys on the out being cold, noticing these things, but they are not in a position to recognize some of these things going on. What does a politician think? I want to be reelected, more societal status, access for me. I have no answers for the real questions. I do not even want to acknowledge the problems at hand. I don't want to admit I have no idea. I will do what I think keeps me in power. What are some things that would reduce climate risk, save environment and other species? Well, a steep carbon tax would help. A steep consumption tax would help. A baby tax would help. What are some things that would help the economy? A new cheap energy source, $50,000 forgivable loan from the government to every American, industrialize Africa and Asian subcontinents. You begin to see that there's a clash between things that are good for the economy and things that are good for the environment. So I live in one of the most progressive states in the country, Minnesota. This is a history of the last 5 years of gas prices. Right now, gas prices have declined from $4 to $2.20. They cannot get through a 15-cent gas tax in Minnesota. Can't get it through, too politically difficult. Okay, this is the summary of our situation, and then I'm going to get into the recommendations of what to do. We don't face an energy shortage, but rather a longage of expectations. For most, not all, people, growth is already over. Current consumption levels are being supported by central banks creating money and guarantees around the world. A carbon tax is a tax on 90% of our workers, the fossil workers, and would be counter to GDP. Solar and wind are getting cheaper, but not cheap enough to continue growth. We need larger than baby steps, but our policies and institutions were designed for baby steps. We're unlikely to do much in advance of a crisis. The main difference between us and earlier humans is A, we're using fossil carbon, and B, we figured all this stuff out, which has to count for something. Okay, so the future, I could imagine 4 quadrants. Number 1 is we find some unbelievably cheap energy source and we continue growth. Number 2 is we continue growth but take down more species and more of the natural world. Number 3 is we manage descent, we manage power down, we manage to become a smaller footprint, a smaller economy. And number 4 would be the Mad Max scenario. Now what's interesting is people that are working in number 1 is most people. Most people are working in that quadrant, and it has the least odds of manifesting. Quadrant 2 is probably highly likely to manifest, but no one realizes that that's what's happening. Quadrant 3, there's virtually no people working on that future. And quadrant 4 is a lot of people anticipate that as the future, yet they're doing nothing about it. So the message here is, I think it's helpful to be mildly optimistic or mildly pessimistic, because the super optimist and the super pessimist are doing nothing, or next to nothing. Okay, so now that's the intro. Now, what to consider and do as a young person facing these risks and opportunities. There's a lot of old people in the audience too, but I'm mostly directing this to young people. But old people, thank you for coming. Okay, so I'm going to have 10 suggestions. But since the suggestions, I don't know any of you, and some of you are here because you have to be for a class, I think we have many different levels of engagement. I think most people will just be ordinary, everyday people. Ordinary people can do extraordinary things. They have and they will. They have kind of a, they're looking out for themselves, but they care about all this other stuff. That's going to be A. After I have my suggestions, I'll have an A. B are kind of the engaged, pro-social futurists who blog about this stuff and are very anxious and engaged about what's happening. They're kind of other species and other generations take up a little bit larger part of their personal circles. So that's going to be labeled with B on all my suggestions. And then we are in a world now where we need Churchills and Gandhis and Yodas. And these would be kind of the more radical things that I don't expect people in this audience necessarily to adopt, but I'm putting them out there as kind of radical suggestions. Okay, number 1, we need to redefine or consider redefining what wealth means to you. So remember, dollars are just a metric, a marker for real capital. There's natural capital, oil, fields, trees, rivers. There's social capital, which is our relationships, our pets. Built capital, that's my house. There's solar panels and chainsaws and a barbecue grill. There's human capital, which is our health and our knowledge. That's my dad. He knows how to fix bones and also grow vegetables, though he complains a lot about it. And that's me identifying an edible mushroom. My parents are in the room, by the way. You might notice them, a sighting. So my first advice then is to value natural, social, and human capital and to make built capital last. Okay, this is very important. I wish I could give a whole hour talk on this phenomenon. The wanting is stronger than the having. Dopamine is a reward neurotransmitter in our brains that our ancestors got when they saw some color by the bushes or they were alerted to some danger. It signals, pay attention to this and do something. They've studied chimpanzees and rats and humans, and they do a signal, like a beep, and then you have to do some work, and then you get a reward. But what happens is you would expect the dopamine would boost when you get the reward. That's not what happens. The dopamine boosts as soon as you get the signal and maintains a level until you do the work, and then, okay, I've done that, and now I'm going to get my reward. And So if you really think about that, and I recommend you guys look this up and delve deeper into it, this is in an economy where we get the signal when we're buying things, but when we have the things, we no longer get the signal. So one of my recent pastimes is I look for agates and stromatolites because it's not hurting anyone and it's a low externality pastime. And also I carry a stromatolite around with me that's 2.5 billion years old. 2.5 billion years old, found a mile from my house. And I like to think about deep time because I think every once in a while you should think about 10 years or 100 years or 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years or 1,000,000,000 years, and it just kind of makes your head realize where we came from and what we face, and there's a deep time in the other direction too. But I digress. I am addicted to finding these rocks. I love finding them. They're beautiful. They're representative of deep time. It's good relaxing with my dog, and now I have buckets full. I don't like to do anything with them when I have them. I just like to find them. But I think our whole economy is that way. If you think about it, we live in a finite physical system that is a stock-based system, and yet our brains are flow-based. One more shopping center, one more rainforest, one more orgasm, one more skyscraper, reset the next day. And our brains are flow-based, and this ends up being a huge problem. And I can speak to this because I managed billionaires' money on Wall Street for a decade. And they put their pants on in the morning, how are we going to make our millions today? It didn't matter how much they had before that. It's a game, and the neurotransmitters are the currency. So my advice is, the B advice is internalize, understand, and utilize the knowledge that the wanting is stronger than the having. Okay, in nature there's relative competition for resources. Relative fitness is what drives us. Relative performance on my salary is more than his. It makes us feel better than if I had less salary and he did too. So I gave this example last year, but I think it's a good one. Would you prefer a 4,000 square foot house in a neighborhood where all your neighbors' houses were bigger, 6,000 square feet? Or would you prefer a 3,000 square foot house in a neighborhood where all the neighbors' houses were smaller? Most people, and not just this study, but any study that has a relative and absolute, most people would prefer the smaller house because it's bigger than their neighbors. So our evolutionary wiring is about relative performance. So kind of the advanced, okay, I got another slide here. If you correlate energy use per capita on the bottom scale and percent very happy on the left scale, there's not a whole lot of correlation once you have your basic energy services met. The United States uses 38 times the energy as the average Filipino, and on this scale, we're about as happy. So I would argue that there are huge returns on using energy and money when you have none. But once you have a certain bare minimum met, you get very, very little extra satisfaction from having more, and because you get reducing marginal returns. So 1C, I would argue that we spend our lives keeping up with the Joneses. I would argue that the radical idea is to enjoy absolute rather than relative wealth, because everyone in this room is fantastically rich relative to the average person in the world, relative to the average human that has ever lived, and probably relative to the average human that will ever live. So relative to nothing, enjoy what you have. Not easy to do, but that's something I think is worth considering. Oh, yeah, and I was going to say the funny punchline is you keep running after the Joneses and you finally catch up to Jones and discover that Jones is an idiot. Okay, number 2, a stronger biophysical alignment with reality. Okay, I have some pithy little acronyms here, from less to enough. Less energy, stuff, and stimulation, and enough is learn ecological principles, spend more time in nature, utility, which is do stuff that actually matters and actually works, like meaningful things instead of frivolous things, and friends and family. So the first recommendation was be more physically flexible. We're heading into a soft or deep recession or depression for a very long time. And there are going to be some people that have a lot of money and have access to resources, but most people will not. Things are going to be getting harder. So when you get out of college or whatever, the first thing you do is don't go buy a huge house that's going to be expensive to heat and other things. Think about your transportation. You don't want to have a very transportation centric job, etc. I think being flexible is very important. To be, don't just stand there, be useful. I think everyone appreciates people that are handy and can do things and don't just sit around. They actually help, and that is the foundation of community. So here I just show MacGyver. Everyone should learn how to make a few really good meals, just 2 or 3, because then wherever you are, you can cook up a meal that everyone appreciates. And then here I have small engine repair. I think physical skills are going to become more important. Okay, for the radical suggestion, buy and name an energy helper. So we see this graph again of decreasing marginal returns. We all assume that if you're going to buy solar, we need to outfit my whole house in solar. Well, electricity is there 24/7 currently for most of us, especially in the industrialized world. Do I need to bake 2 turkeys at 2:30 in the a.m. if I want to? No, I don't need to do that. A lot of the electricity access is the supernormal stimuli that it's always there and we don't need it. I would argue that 1 watt or whatever it takes to charge my cell phone is really meaningful. 10 watts for a computer. So it's that first 100 watts which are really valuable. So you could buy a real cheap, small solar thing, and not to change the world necessarily, but just to understand the biophysical relationship between the sun hitting that technology, providing you with services. It's a way to biophysically tether your world more to reality. And here's a bonus suggestion. Chickens, the original solar collector. I don't know the requirements in different cities, but chickens go, run out, they get things that are in grubs and seeds and bugs and such, and they come back and lay an egg that you can eat. So that is a natural ecosystem, ecological way to harvest things, and also cheap and sometimes fun. Okay, number 3, think for yourself. Do not fall into social monkey traps. This is a famous experiment where they had Confederates in a room, and if all the Confederates said that this line on the left was taller than all 3 lines on the right, 75% of people said, yes, this line is longer. We are amazingly susceptible to peer pressure and doing what other people think, even without thinking for ourselves. Our brains are modular and specialized. And for time reasons, I'm going to skip by that. But we have, each of us, everyone sitting in the audience here has their own representation of what the real world is like. Yet all of our representations are different. And all of them are different than the real physical world. So, you know, a lot of us, I know some of you because you've heard me speak before, and I know the language that we use, that our virtual worlds are less dissimilar than me and Scott Walker say. But all of our virtual worlds are different. So advice to the everyday people is try to narrow the gap between the virtual and the real worlds. And you need to have self-reflection on that and also education on first principles. The second recommendation would be do not be afraid to think really differently. I think humans are now in a world, in a situation where alien thinking should be prized. It's more important than intelligence. Intelligence is what got us to this precipice. Sidetrack, an understanding of our situation can only occur in individual minds. This is a picture of an amoeba. I liken an amoeba to our current human civilization. There's no one in charge. A lot of you sitting here in the audience have more power than the president. There's no one at the White House that knows all this stuff. There's a lot of individuals that know a lot of it, but we think we have an illusion that we pass the baton upward into the hierarchy and then naturally it's all assimilated into this coherent strategy and policy. It's just not true. Understanding the totality of our situation can only happen in individual minds, and therefore individual minds are powerful. So this is the radical suggestion, which I'm just going to read through really quickly, to ride parallel to the amoeba as an individual activist. disbelieve in magical thinking. You have to be numerate enough to understand medium math, exponential functions, and graphs, understand and follow the basic rules of logic and scientific method, care about something beyond oneself and immediate kin, have a very low discount rate relative to the human norm, have a willingness to at least entertain unpalatable thoughts about the future, have the will and ability to disregard social signals of discouragement, disbelieve that gods or alpha humans have things under control, understand the basics of multiple scientific disciplines and systems thinking, be self-policing and disciplined enough to significantly avoid common fallacies, cognitive biases, and monkey traps, etc. Become an activist to propel things of value into the deep time future. Every one of those things I read, eliminates some of our population. It's not an easy thing to do that, but I think this is something to throw out to young people to consider. Number 4, don't blame or avoid it as much as possible. So it is in our wiring to form tribal units, especially in times of stress. It's called in-group, out-group behavior in sociology. We naturally blame others when something goes wrong. It's the environmentalists, it's the liberals, it's the Chinese, it's the greedy rich, it's the lazy poor. It happens almost without thinking. But it's really the fossil coworkers are asking for pay raises. That's the real fault, and it's not really anyone's fault. Now, yes, there are sociopaths who are on Wall Street and in government and in medicine and in law, but there's also very good people in those professions as well. So I would say that in general, in a time of anxiety and maybe slower economic growth and difficulties, my advice for the everyday version is to count to 10 before reacting. I know that's difficult. I, last week, flipped someone off who passed me going 90 miles an hour, and that was why I thought of this advice. Because I think, there's always these know-it-alls and everything, and you're like, oh, I want to, just stop and count to 10. If you still want to react, then that's okay. The medium level advice is to take ownership and responsibility. I have a very rich friend who has understood a lot of my energy and environmental comments over the last few years. He is nonstop, every other email he sends me, it's Obama this and Obama that, and he's a liar and he's a bad person and it's all his fault. And everything is the fault of the president, as if the president has that much control. So the other thing is all of us, all of a sudden, there's a new presidential election. It's all the news. It's like, well, the next president's going to be better. No, it's going to be the same old stuff. It's going to be even harder because we're further down on the next more expensive tier of fossil energy. We've got more environmental problems. We're losing more species. We're printing more money. It's going to be harder, Democrat or Republican. So my advice, middle level advice, is to take ownership for some of this. And that doesn't mean you have to solve the problems, but it's not to blame others as a natural reaction. And then the Jedi level would be a diplomat between the environment and the economy. We have so many environmentalists that, in my opinion, rightly care about what's happening to our natural world, but they're oblivious, in my opinion, to some of the supply chain physical energy constraints. And yet the experts on the economy are oblivious to the environmental constraints, and there needs to be bridges built because we're all going to be in this together, and somehow there has to be a common language. Number 5, play, be silly, live, have fun. 90 years ago, John Maynard Keynes predicted that in 100 years, which is 10 years from now, we would be working 8 hours per week because our productivity would go up, because fossil fuels were so unbelievably powerful. Well, 90 years later, we're working 50 hours a week or whatever. There's economic studies show that when people get a raise and their hourly job rate goes up, like from $15 an hour to $20 an hour, instead of working less, they work more because there's more reward. So our whole concept of jobs and work is kind of messed up. And I think that they did a study on a mass murderer sniper, a psychologist did, and then he looked at like thousands of other ones and found, amazingly, that these sociopaths who ended up being murderers lacked play. They lacked play in their lives as children and as adults. So the lack of opportunities for unstructured and imaginative play can keep children from becoming well-adjusted adults. And free play, as scientists are calling it, is critical for becoming socially adept, coping with stress, and building cognitive and problem-solving skills. So I think given what we're facing, we have to be kind to ourselves or we're going to burn out. You have to use humor and laughter and play every day. So I would say play and laugh every day is a must for all of us, especially living in these times. And kind of the mid-level recommendation is don't be afraid to be silly in random situations like this one. And kind of the advanced one is repeat, be silly. I kind of ran out of time, so I did that one twice. Okay, number 6, use technology, don't be enslaved by it. So, a few years ago, my organization did a recruiting seminar, and there were 5 of us there, and we interviewed 7 other people. And in one of the breaks, it just randomly came up that none of the 5 of us have had a television for over the last 10 years. I gave mine up in 1999. I think television is horribly bad for our young people and our culture. It is beta brainwaves that we're just passively taking in. I readily admit I'm addicted to the internet. It's a little bit different. It's alpha brainwaves. We're being more engaged. But television just deadens our senses. Now, I watch Game of Thrones on Netflix, of course, and things like that. That's a little bit different. But just sitting down for 4 hours in front of the TV or 8 hours, I mean, the amount of technology, online, television, social media that an average 14-year-old now consumes is amazing. So on that note, go on internet, social media, and even electricity holidays. I am very worried about young people that don't have the attention span to someday maybe read a book or plant a garden or whatever because they're so unbelievably addicted to the technology of the day. And then the kind of the advanced Churchill Gandhi advice is to create cross-generational tech, not just gadgets. Because a lot of the technology that we're having right now is just new apps and new toys and new ways to hijack our brains. What if we could use that technology? Wouldn't be profitable necessarily to build a 200-year or a 300-year solar panel, something that would cross generations. Well, there wouldn't be a lot of profit in it because the companies, 200 years, they wouldn't need to buy a new one. But that's the type of technology that we need, in my opinion. And since my parents are here, I told them I was doing this talk last night, and here's what my mom said. I said, what should I tell the kids? And she said, I would tell them to keep doing whatever they're doing now and conserve. And my dad says we need more plumbers. Okay, 7, strengthen the agenda of the self-aware mind versus the agenda of the gene. Well, all of us, of course, have the agenda of the gene because we evolved from our ancestors and their ancestors before them. This is a colorful graphic showing the reptilian deep area of our brain, and on top of it, the mammalian emotional centers, and then our thinking, cogitating, planning mind. And these genes, most of the things that we like to do are bad for the environment, ultimately. We've gone from doing those things on an empty planet when it didn't really matter. But now we're on a full planet, 7.3 billion of us. So doing a lot of these things ends up having externalities. So my first advice would be to practice free won't, which is, I don't really believe that we have free will in the moment, but you can exercise free won't, and by doing that, you're just kind of shrinking the impulse of some of these things that shout out to you. A little bit more advanced is to build neural structures for when tomorrow becomes today. If you envision the future or your life as a river, when all of a sudden you come upon a situation, it's very difficult to swim against the current when you're faced with something. But if you plan for it ahead of time and envision what might happen kind of as a dry run or as a practice, then when you come to that place in the river, you've already built some new neurons and a new structure, and you might be able to behave differently. So what's the strongest genetic impulse is to procreate. Just looking at these babies, what do we feel? We feel they're so cute and you just want to squish them and hold them and play with them. And that's in our genes, right? But I would argue, especially facing a world with limited resources, especially facing harder economic times, don't feel pressured to have children right out of college, because it's going to be more difficult. You're going to have more problems being flexible. And the truth is we share 98.8% of our genes with chimpanzees. We share 99.9 something percent with each other. I am 99.9 something percent related to everyone in this room. We don't need my Sasquatch body necessarily going through into the future, because we got enough humans. We need the better ideas. We need Herman Daly's ecological principles. We need to live lighter on the planet. Again, this is more advanced one. And I mean, to be totally honest, I feel awkward in even saying it with my mom in the room. But you know, this is what I think. I mean, this is I'm not recommending this. I'm saying it's something you should think about. Okay, number 8, localize. Meet and engage with people where you live. This makes sense. We're headed for a more local economy. Maybe not next year, but in the next 10 years. Buy locally sourced made things as much as you can. 3 different beer choices for y'all. And work to re-regionalize and localize supply chains. That means Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, instead of buying things in Korea or Germany, et cetera. What does that mean? It means things are going to get more expensive. But it also means we're going to be more resilient if things are made, the components are made regionally. And finally, aspire to deep time coexistence of humans with other large complex life. We haven't done that. We don't even talk about it. Could you imagine that in 50 years, your grandkids were like, Grandma, I saw a squirrel yesterday. Let me tell you about it. How horrible would that be? We are baby stepping our way into such a world because yesterday looks so much like today that we don't even notice it. Yet living in Wisconsin, you all have seen pictures growing up of like the massive deer and all these muskies that they caught in the 1920s and 30s. And you know, we've forgotten that because we've never seen it. But it's real and it's happened all over the earth. So I would argue that on this particular point, an environmental point, is we need to educate and inspire others on new aspirations and values. I think we need more warriors and mystics. I think given what we face, to say, I'm not flying anymore, I live in the woods, I use hardly any carbon, that's about accomplishing as much to solve the problem as Donald Trump. I think we need to look beyond that, and people need to engage in creative ways. And then for the real radical thing, I would consider changing your self-identity away from consumer, away from American, away from I got to make this much money and I'm looking for promotion, but to live kind of a parallel life where you live on half of your income and you divert the other half to a creative, saving a particular species, doing active earth work that no one else is probably going to do. And I know people that have done this and have had amazing lives, living on next to nothing, but accomplishing great things. And I think we just need to expand that demographic. Okay, my summary of suggestions. Redefine wealth, individually and culturally, a stronger biophysical tether to reality, think for yourself, avoid blaming, live, play, and laugh, change how you use technology, the agenda of the self-aware mind, go local, and think about and fight for deep time existence. I had to remove these recommendations because I felt like I was being hypocritical. Get in the best physical fitness of your life, turn in your smartphone for a dumb phone and keep it in your pocket. I think that both of those are good advice, but I haven't managed to do them myself, so I had to take them off. So number 10, I didn't really have up there, but I want you to think about what should you do facing this? What should you consider? So in a longer term lens, this is kind of where we are. And we really genetically are wired to only care about this year or this week or this decade maybe. We don't think about this large long-term lens, yet we're impacting that long-term lens. So I'm nearing my conclusion, and I would say that I don't know what to do. I don't think anyone knows what to do. I think there's a million things that need to be done, and we cannot know ahead of time which things will be trivial and which things will be very impactful. And I would argue that we need more people on this chessboard. We need more people engaged in creating a better future. And another thing I would say, it's kind of a bad example in one sense because it means one side fights the other side and knocks them over. So in that sense, I disagree with this graphic, even though it's cool, because we somehow need to cross the aisle, and we're all humans, we're all living on a planet that the natural world is dying, and somehow we have to integrate that into our politics. Thank you.